Turn-based JRPGs are one of the oldest video game genres that's been around since the early 80s and is still around today. But over the past decade, JRPGs have been kind of fading into obscurity, and nowadays they're not as big or popular in the West as they used to be back in the PS1 and PS2 eras. In fact, the only JRPGs that still manage to sell millions of copies are Persona games, Metaphori Fantasio, and the mainline Final Fantasy games, while the bulk of JRPGs generally sell less than 500,000 copies. So I'd even go as far as to say that JRPGs peaked around the mid-2000s and have been on a steady decline ever since. So whenever the conversation comes up, everyone just points at the Western gamers' apparent dislike for turn-based combat and calls it a day. But while this is a valid reason, it's certainly not the only one, and until we acknowledge the real problems that are plaguing the genre, nothing is going to change. So I think it's time to sit down and have a talk about the current state of the JRPG genre and treat this discussion with the brutal honesty it deserves. As someone who grew up with turn-based JRPGs in the 90s, I can't help but notice that nowadays, the genre feels a bit stagnant. And if you compare the most recent JRPGs to the ones we used to play on the PS1, for example, you're probably going to find a lot more similarities than differences. I can't remember the last time I played a new JRPG that genuinely surprised me with its gameplay mechanics, as other than adding a handful of quality of life features, most of the ones I've played over the past 15 years have largely felt the same as their PS1 ancestors. In fact, I think there was a lot more experimentation back in the 90s when developers were actually trying out different mechanics, hybrid combat systems, and fusions between different genres. Now, if you compare that to the JRPGs released over the past decade, you're gonna notice that most of them feature very similar gameplay mechanics. And don't get me wrong, I don't think that every JRPG should reinvent the wheel, but think of it this way. If we take Metaphori Fantasio, a recent and quite successful JRPG, and we downgrade its visuals so that it can run on a PS1, we're not gonna get a JRPG that feels ahead of its time for the PS1. We're gonna get a game that blends right in with the rest of the JRPGs that were actually made in the 90s. And I think more people should realize the seriousness of this issue. The problem is that this not only applies to gameplay mechanics, but to the visuals and graphical fidelity as well, as most of the modern JRPGs either go for an old school pixel art aesthetic, like Square Enix's series of HD 2D games, or they end up looking like remastered PS2 or PS3 titles, like in the case of Atlas Games, which released a new game in 2024 that looks worse than the remastered PS2 game they released that same year, and this is not an exaggeration of mine. This generally gives JRPGs a low-budget feel that makes games released over the past decade feel like they belong on a console from a couple of generations ago. And while it is true that many JRPG developers operate on a tight budget, it often feels like they're just doing the bare minimum to create a functional game and nothing more. I do agree with the idea that visuals are not the most important thing in a video game, but they're also the first thing you see, and like it or not, poor visuals will make people lose interest in a game instantly. And yes, in the case of Square Enix, it's an artistic choice, and I honestly think that the HD 2D games look very nice, so my criticism about poor visuals doesn't apply here. But Square Enix is worth over $5 billion, and they're making pixel art games with slightly modernized visuals and indie tier mechanics that they're selling for $60.
Welcome home, Elliot!
So yes, the art style is beautiful, but the games themselves feel like they were made by a small indie studio on a shoestring budget, not a multi-billion-dollar corporation that essentially pioneered the JRPG genre, which makes these games feel a bit low effort, especially for the price they're asking. We all know that game developers have become averse to taking risks nowadays, but in the case of turn-based JRPGs, they just feel stuck in the past. It's not even about taking risks at this point, but more about just keeping up with the times, because right now, JRPGs feel very dated in every single way that counts, and it seems like Square Enix is the only JRPG developer that is still making games with current-gen visuals and mechanics, even though it only applies to mainline Final Fantasy games. Another problem that plagues JRPGs is that most of them nowadays are leaning extremely heavily into the anime art style tropes and vibes, and the truth is that a lot of people love Japanese games but don't like anime. So whenever a new JRPG gets announced and people see the same cartoonish art style, another cast of teenage characters, and the overly familiar tropes that the genre has been milking for decades, they lose interest in that game unless they're anime superfans. And even then, not everyone that likes anime also likes JRPGs. I think there is a certain uniformity to shonen anime that leads to characters looking and sounding the same across unrelated franchises, and it often feels like the same small group of like 10 voice actors are voicing every single anime and JRPG character in existence.
We're the best family of merchants in the whole universe! Ichi-Daime of the Colucci family!
The tropes are always the same, the character archetypes are always the same, the dialogue is childish and simplistic even when seemingly mature themes are being discussed, and a great number of JRPGs are built around this idea of a group of teenagers that are saving the world through the power of friendship, which makes their stories feel quite predictable to anyone that has even a bit of experience with the genre.
Whatever you say.
As a teenager, I used to think that JRPGs would continue growing alongside us and that the genre would ultimately mature and become something much bigger. But now that I'm in my 30s, it feels like JRPGs never actually moved past their teenage phase. There is a real shortage of JRPGs with more realistic art styles and mature themes, so it feels like nowadays liking anime has almost become a requirement for enjoying the genre. Now, don't get me wrong, JRPGs have always been anime coded, but back in the day there was a bit more artistic variety, with some games going for a darker and more grounded art style, like Vagrant Story, Kadelka, Parasite Eve, and Lost Odyssey, to name a few examples. Just to be clear, I'm not saying that JRPGs should drop the anime art style entirely and just focus on realism instead. This video is not meant to be an attack on anime-themed games or their fan bases, because I also play and love these games. All I'm saying is that the genre has been pushed into a very specific aesthetic, which was not the case a few decades ago, and that there needs to be a bit more variety in terms of the art styles and themes that JRPGs offer, because right now, JRPG fans are not even buying most JRPGs, and because there is a demand for non-anime games with a whole untapped market out there yearning for a type of JRPG that doesn't seem to exist anymore. The thing is that many JRPG fans will often reduce Japanese art to just anime, so then if you don't like anime, that just means you hate Japanese media as a whole. And this is not only wrong, but also a form of unnecessary gatekeeping. But the reality is that some of the most popular and successful video games ever made are Japanese, but not anime, like Elden Ring, Resident Evil, Silent Hill, Metal Gear Solid, and so many other amazing games.
Did you like it?
So the problem is not that JRPGs are Japanese games, the problem is that most of them look, feel, and sound very childish because they rely entirely on anime visuals and tropes instead of carving their own identity like every other game genre. It's kind of like how a lot of Western games use that Marvel superhero style of writing nowadays, and everyone just hates it.
So, what's the plan, boss?
Not your boss, Frank.
It's a bit sad that there's so much gatekeeping in the JRPG community nowadays, and that people get so hung up on a single art style that even the mere thought of JRPGs going for more grounded and mature themes and art styles is considered heresy, despite the fact that JRPG fans also love games like Lost Odyssey, Vagrant Story, and Parasite Eve. So honestly, I don't even understand why people get so defensive and why this is a point of contention for the JRPG community. Because the bottom line is this, people don't hate turn-based combat nearly as much as developers and JRPG fans claim they do, and we saw that last year with Clair Obscur Expedition 33. So, however you may feel about Clair Obscur, the fact of the matter is that it's a turn-based JRPG minus the J part that sold over 8 million copies in its first year, so I think that JRPG developers should treat this as a wake-up call. And one of the major differences between Clair Obscur and every other JRPG released over the past 2 generations is that Clair Obscur looks like a current gen game and not like an anime game. It looks and feels like what a lot of people expected JRPGs would evolve into, and that's why it was hailed as a breath of fresh air in a stale genre that hasn't released a non-anime title since, I don't know, 2008. And I realize that this is going to be a tough pill to swallow for a lot of JRPG fans, but I hope that at least a handful of Japanese developers will realize this, because at the end of the day, I believe that people should care more about improving or evolving the JRPG genre, instead of endlessly defending the perpetuation of the shonen anime art style and its tropes within a stagnant genre that struggles to sell its games to a few 100,000 people. right now, Clair Obscur does not have a Japanese equivalent. There is no current gen JRPG made in the old school Final Fantasy style, so perhaps it's time to change that and even go beyond. I truly believe that JRPGs have so much room for growth and that there's never been a better time to try and revitalize the genre, so I really hope that Clair Obscur's success will become the proof that Japanese developers needed in order to shed the fallacious belief that Western gamers simply hate turn-based combat, because JRPGs are not defined by their combat mechanics, and if you manage to create an amazing video game, people are going to play it regardless of its combat system. And if you still have any doubts, just remember that the 2023 and 2025 Game of the Year winners were both games with turn-based combat, and both of them achieved insane financial success. But anyway, this is all I have for you today, and now I'd love to hear your thoughts on the matter, as this video is only meant to start a conversation about the state of JRPGs in 2026. Because at the end of the day, even if we may disagree on various things, I still believe that we all want to see the genre grow and prosper. So if you enjoyed this video, please use a limit break on that like button and consider subscribing for more reviews, impressions, and brutally honest takes like this one, because someone's gotta say the uncomfortable part out loud, and I guess that someone is me. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.